if you're not using popovers, today I'm going to show you how to do this. We'll talk about the basics of how to use them as far as interacting with them. And then we'll talk about styling, including a bunch of new CSS that if you don't know about, you need to know about. You ready? Let's go. Hey, what's up? My name is Chris and welcome to Coding in Public. All right, so let's talk about popovers. We're going to do it in two stages. First of all, just to get it operational. And then secondly, we're going to make it look decent. So you can see over here, we've got a button and I've got this popover content that I want to show only when I click the button. And you can see that reflected over here in the HTML. We've got a button and then we've also got this popover container where I want it to act as the popover. So there's a couple things to note here. Number one, note that I have an ID. Secondly, these don't have to be next to each other. This can be anywhere we want in the DOM, and it sits actually above on the top layer once we add popover to it. So to make this actually work, we need to add two things. First of all, popover, this attribute right here. Oops, I erased the class there. We'll now make this all disappear, give it a bunch of default styling from the browser, and set it on that top layer. Now to actually make it interactive with this open me button, I need to come over here and add one thing, which is popovertarget. We're simply going to point this to the ID of pop1. That's the name I give it right here. Now, just like that, we've made it operational. I can come over here and click, and notice it opens up directly up top here. I can hit escape on my keyboard and it returns the focus over here. In fact, if I come over here and hit tab, you'll notice that the next thing in focus is inside the popover. So it actually shifts the focus to that as well. Everything works automatically. One more little note about making this functional. If I want to make this to where when I click the button here, it closes, I need to do one other thing, which is to come inside here to the button. And I'm going to add both the popover action, or popover target that is. We're going to point this to the same area, but by default, this will simply open it. That's the default action, but you can change that action with popover target action. And here I'd say close. Now, just like that, now I can come over here and click or use the keyboard, hit focus, or come over here, click either way and hit close, and it will actually close it. So that's functionality. And you can see just how easy that is. There's actually great support for this as well. You can see it's baseline 2025. We're at 87% already. There's polyfills as well if you're interested in that, but we're quickly getting to the point where really this should be our default for anything like this. All the accessibility wins, the way it's declared, the way it sits on the top layer, all the default styles it gets. The browsers are giving us this for free, so let's take it. Now, how do we actually make this look decent? First of all, you're going to note here that I have everything inside the content here inside of a separate div. You don't have to do it this way, but there's just a couple things you should note. In fact, if I come over here and we inspect this, I'm going to come into the main, and here's our actual popover container. Now, you'll notice that by default, it has a bunch of default styling. This popover that sits on the top layer has an overlay of none with imported on it, which means you cannot override it. It's a user agent style sheet. It's as high up as it gets. So you can't touch this. And then you'll notice there's a couple other things. For instance, when you don't have a popover-open, which is a new attribute we'll talk about in a second, it has display none on it. So it's actually display none. It's fixed. You'll see it has a width and height. It inherits a bunch of colors. And all this is by default. Notice my margin and my padding is crossed out. And that's simply because I have a reset up here that removes that from everything. You may not have that, but I just wanted to note that in case that's something you have. Now notice I have this pop content here of display grid. And that's because if I want to come in here and do my pop container, if I want to say, oh, this should be display of grid, notice that it actually overrides this right here, which means it's always visible. So I don't want that. So the easiest way to make sure I style it the way I want is just to have kind of a wrapper inside. We need to know kind of how the browser is going to style this by default so that we can now do the second stage here, which is styling this the way we'd want it to be. So the first thing I'm going to do is let's come over here and let's just add some padding. We'll do something like 2 rem, and then let's do border radius just to match our other stuff. Border radius, and I think I had that at something like 4 pixels. All right, so that's good enough already. In fact, why don't I just click it here? Yeah, there we go. So you can see now we've got the padding, the border radius on here. There's a couple of the things that we may want to add. So I'd probably want to have some kind of inline size. This sets like the width of it. We could just say, let's set a mins. It'll choose the smallest of these two things. We could do something like 80 view width or 25 rem. So you can see now it gets smaller, and depending on the screen size, it will choose one or the other. All right, now, next thing we need to do is to think about how we want this to actually display. Now, right now it's up top here. It's fixed to the top corner of the screen, but ultimately I want it to be connected to this button itself. And we can use another little bit of new CSS here. We're going to use position area. Now, position area allows us to set it in reference to the actual anchor itself, which is the button. So we're going to say we want it to be on the bottom, for instance, and notice it should move right to the bottom. And I can even say, hey, I want it to go at the bottom and I want it to go over to the right. So I can use span right that pushes it all the way over. Can't quite see that because of the screen, but if I move over here, you'll see it tries to be all the way over And if it can't, then it does its best. Now, there's a bunch more you can do with that. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but we probably also want to have some kind of block margin up top. So I can say margin block start. So we're basically saying the top margin here, and I'll say something like 1 rem, which means it pulls off of its target about 1 rem. So just like that, we've already got a great default. So if I come over here, I open and close it, everything looks great. It's where I want it to be. Now, of course, I can move this around. If I want to say top span right, now it'll open up top just like that, except now I need to change this to block end. So wherever you want it, you can position it with the position area and margin block end. Now, this is not quite as widely supported, but it's still mostly there. Anchor has a bunch of bugs, it seems like, that they're still working out, but we're getting really close to be able to use all these in production grade sites. Now, what if you want to actually transition this? That's the next level of difficulty here. You'll notice that when we looked at the default styling here, it started with display of none. What does it look like once we're here on Popover? So here again, let's check here. We're going to check the actual Popover container. If I can get to that, there we go. And you'll notice that when it's open, we go to display a block. Now, you probably know you cannot transition between none and block, except you can with a new CSS property here. If I come over here and do transition behavior, and we set this to allow-discrete, now I can actually transition between these two things from none to block and back and forth. So let's try to do that. And you'll notice we're going to hit a little bug, well, not a bug, but something we're going to need to change. So if I say, let's take our display, we'll set it to like 2000 milliseconds for now. Then I also want to set opacity, and we're going to do 2000 milliseconds as well. I want to transition on both of these items. Now, what I want to do is use that popover-open attribute that we saw in the browser, popover-open, like this. And I want to say when it's open, I want to set the opacity here to 1. Now, that means I also need to actually set it to 0 to start with. One thing to know is transition behavior actually has to come afterwards for this to actually work on the display. So if I come over here and now click, you'll notice it opens slowly, but now it goes over here and then it fades out. So what's happening? Why is the opacity only happening when it fades out? And why is it moving around? Well, it has to do with one of those behaviors that we saw default added in the browser. And that is the property called overlay. So we're going to set this to the same 2000 milliseconds like this. And now it should allow us to transition between display and overlay, which means it won't be moving it around. So it'll actually fade off directly there. Now, because we're going from 0 to 1, it's only actually transitioning when we close it because it's going from 1 back to 0. There is another new CSS property we can use called starting style. Well, it's a declaration here. And what we can do is just say where it should start. So opacity 0, for instance, means now it's going to start at 0, transition to 1, and then transition from 1 back to 0 when it closes. Now I should get it both ways. If I come over here and click, you'll see it slowly fades in and it also slowly fades out. Now, because these are separate, we can actually also then distinguish where we want these things to be. So let's move it. So I'm going to come over here with translate. We'll do 0 left and right. And then let's do something like, I don't know, let's do like 10 pixels up and down. And then let's bring it over here and say when it's open, we should just go to 10 pixels. Now, maybe I also want to transition it differently here as well. So I could go -10. And then to make sure we've got the same timing as everything else, let's come over here and do translate, and we'll do 2000 milliseconds. Now, if I come over here and I click, it should move down into place. I click again, and it moves down into place that way. Now, typically, I'd actually want it to be kind of the same idea here. So I want it to start at 10 pixels, and that way it kind of starts close to the button, moves away, and when I click again, it should kind of come back to the button. Now I can change these all. Let's do something like just 200 milliseconds. And now when I click, it'll go up and close down. And all of this is controlled with all these new CSS properties. We looked at how to add a popover and then all these different styling things, including allowing discrete transitions between display none and display block. We used the @popover, this new pseudo-class, starting style as well to tell it exactly where to start. And that way we can control both the entrance and the exit in their own separate way. Now, I don't know about you, but that would have taken so much JavaScript in the past, and now it's all baked into browsers along with a bunch of new cool things that I was able to show you today. Let me know how you're using popovers, and if you're not, why you're not. All right, I'll catch you in the next one. Happy coding.